Hello and welcome to the first instalment of my History of Tekken series. Today, the very word is synonymous with the fighting genre. It boasts 6 main canonical instalments, numerous spin-offs, 3 movie adaptations, an anime, CGI, and a pretty terrible live-action feature if you've seen it. If you haven't, I wouldn't recommend it. And all of this was carried out in the space of just over a decade. On top of that, it even has its own museum, which speaks volumes about the continued popularity and significance of this series in the context of video game history. Now, just to lay a couple of ground rules for my History of Tekken series. Firstly, with my videos today, I've tended to look at games through an inquisitive lens, in that I sort of prompt throughout my clips questions and examples of the medium of video games' potential as an art form and its status, growing status, and controversial in some senses status as an art form. And although I think there are numerous avenues, some of which I've already touched upon in previous videos, that can be used to explore and validate the medium status as an art, there are only certain games that, in my opinion, meet this criteria of true artistic realization in video games. This is, of course, completely subjective and based on my own idea of what art is and, what I think art in video games is. And I'll more than likely go on to talk about this at length in future. I'll probably dedicate a clip to it, a video to it. But needless to say, I'll be omitting any sort of artistic approach to the Tekken series because I see it as a much more primitive game. And I don't mean that in a derogative sense, but I mean it in the sense that it fulfills the most fundamental and intrinsic purpose for the existence of a video game, which is to be fun and entertaining. Beyond this, despite the fantastic music, the great the graphics and the characters and whatnot, I don't feel that it can really be elevated to the status of an artistic game. To offer this a little more context with a game that I do feel is art, and let's say Final Fantasy VIII is Starry Night by Van Gogh, then by way of comparison, Tekken, any Tekken, is a poster by Alphonse Mucha. That is to say, these are both paintings, but they represent and are intended for very different purposes. One of these paintings hangs in a gallery and demands scrutiny, emotional investment, and this sort of probing kind of art historical kind of significance. The other, on the other hand, was designed solely for the purpose to attract and entertain, which the work of Mucha does. But that's how I kind of see Tekken on the scale of video games as artistic artifacts. And secondly, I'll also only be looking at the Tekken games that I feel significantly contribute or otherwise progressed this franchise. Needless to say, Tekken turned into a veritable cash cow for Namco, and there's so much Tekken media out there, ranging from card games through to comic books, and all of these could be mentioned or talked about to some degree or another. However, I feel that the only aspects of the Tekken series that really warrant significant scrutiny or discussion are the main canon, by which I mean Tekken 1 through to 6. I also want to cover the tag tournament games because I feel these are a direct response to what, in my opinion, is one of the biggest factors of Tekken's success, and that, of course, is its characters, which I'll talk about in depth later. I also somehow feel the need to talk about the movie adaptations. I feel these are an interesting aspect of this franchise, and I suppose kind of opening up to other fighting game franchises in general, such as Street Fighter, because they're interesting when it comes to communicating and elaborating on plot points to audiences for these games, because in-game, obviously, it's notoriously difficult to convey any sense of plot or story, and yet somehow we all know what's going on, when it comes to these Tekken games. And I am kind of a bit reluctant to kind of omit a lot of these accessories, if you will, to the Tekken brand, because there are games like, for example, Death by Degrees, which was a PlayStation game starring Nina Williams, and it wasn't brilliant, but it's kind of interesting, and it was a kind of interesting spin-off. have happen, and a sort of unlikely spin-off as well. But unfortunately, because I tend to waffle on quite a lot in these videos as it is, it's a necessary omission, and I may have to reduce it to, at most a passing mention, which I already have. And lastly, an overarching investigation through these videos, well, audio, as you may well have established if you watched any other installments I've had, intend for these to be kind of used as audio clips, so you can sort of plug in and go away and do something else while you're listening, because I go on for so long, and I wouldn't expect anyone to be kind of engaged with any visual element that I'd care to put up there, so I generally just stick with the game covers and talk. But an overarching aspect that I'm looking to cover in this investigation is what exactly is it that we love about the Tekken series? What factors differentiate this game from other major fighting franchises that, looking at the context of the time, these franchises were all pretty much in full swing by the time Tekken came about. So how, when you already have games like Virtua Fighter, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, how did Tekken come to kind of emerge and then dominate this kind of market that was already to a large degree saturated with fighting games? So the first Tekken game, the first installment of the Tekken series, came out in 1994. This was 1 month after Sega's flagship fighting game Virtua Fighter 2. At this time, Capcom, who obviously the developers of Street Fighter, they were working on their Street Fighter Alpha series, which would debut the following year. Mortal Kombat was yet to release its third installment, which would also be released the following year, 1995, and also the comparatively short-lived Battle Arena Toshinden series was in development at this time, and I think we can reasonably kind of argue that this series was pretty much killed off thanks to the popularity of the Tekken franchise. Now, as with all Tekken games that followed, Tekken 1 was developed and published by Namco, which are now, as I'm sure you're aware, Namco Bandai. This developer-publisher was a veritable powerhouse in the gaming world. They brought us Pac-Man, they brought us Ridge Racer, they brought us Air Combat, they brought us many, many games. They'd been around since the latter 70s, so had serious clout when it came to taking a foray into the relatively new realm of 3D fighters, and they could probably, easily afford to take this risk and quite comfortably, try and spread and break new ground and break into new markets. Which obviously, they kind of did quite successfully, because Tekken became, to my knowledge, the most famous, fighting franchise out there, on a par with Street Fighter. Now, even at face value in 1994, Tekken must have been a breath of fresh air for this sort of game. Looking at Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Fighter 2 kind of continued a trend which is a common sight throughout the history of fighting games. There's the archetypal Ryu-style protagonist, complete with the karate gi or ki, whatever it's called, a karate uniform and a headband, and the protagonist, the figurehead of the game, being a serious and disciplined fighter, somewhat sensationalist, on a quest to kind of get more power, or whatever they sort of do, and just trying to prove he's awesome generally. And I think this sort of loose plotline must have been getting a bit stale for gamers. When Tekken came out, I think it really broke the mould. It had this cast of motley characters that were admittedly sensationalist in some sense. For example, King's Mask and Yoshimitsu, everything about him is kind of crazy. But comparatively, this game is pretty realistic, pretty grounded in the world as we know it, against these bombastic, larger-than-life characters found in Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter. The Namco team went further than this, and also introduced movesets for the Tekken characters, and these movesets are kind of infamous for having their roots in real-world fighting styles and trying to adhere as closely as possible to these respective fighting styles. I mean, for example, there's Mishima-style karate, so it's kind of karate, but it's got a few unrealistic elements to it. Aikido, Jiu-Jitsu. There was a concerted effort by the team to create a real consistency between Tekken and the real world. A more modern example of this in a Tekken game is the character of Steve Fox, who I'd like to mention because it's a really kind of unique and cool example. Steve Fox was introduced in Tekken 4, and as a practitioner of professional boxing, like Western boxing, there's no kick button for this character because it doesn't tally with his method of combat. The kick buttons will actually make him bob and weave like a professional boxer will, but it's these little kind of intricacies that really lend themselves to the feature that Tekken was looking to sell, and that is authenticity. I mean, games like Mortal Kombat, which have their nigh on ridiculous, though entertaining, kind of finishing moves, and Street Fighter, which has its iconic Hadouken fireballs and Yoga Flame, sort of maneuvers, these represent an abstracted world of larger-than-life, almost deified kind of fighters that Tekken contended and divorced itself from, simply by bringing the genre of fighting games quite literally back down to earth. But having said that, despite its adherence to reality in one sense, in this sense, it did follow the formulaic approach of most existing fighting games in that, the characters had a health bar that would slowly deplete with each successive attack by an opponent. And even getting run through with Yoshimitsu's blade, it won't kill you outright, which is obviously kind of, divorcing it from reality a little bit. Just to digress slightly on this point, the only game I know to truly break the mould of the fighting genre in this sense would be Squaresoft's 1997 game Bushido Blade. And this game is absolutely fantastic in its adherence to the samurai code and real-life rules of, life and death, really. If you get stabbed in the vital organs or in the face in this game, you're dead. If you get hit in the arm, you can't use that arm. It's really kind of brilliant, and I'm definitely going to, discuss that game one day. But, sorry, I'm digressing here. The first three Tekken games, in fact, also see players kind of jumping about 10-20 foot up in the air. I don't really know what the purpose of this was, but I think perhaps maybe it's the technology at the time that maybe made realistic jumping and a gravity mechanic difficult to implement. I'm not sure. I'm not really sure what the explanation of that is, but again, it's another small example of how Tekken didn't quite, bring it 100% back down to earth. Now, moving on to the buttons and gameplay of the first game, and keeping in kind of step with this whole idea of, reality in the fighting game and striving for an authenticity in the fighting game, it also revolutionised game mechanics of the fighting genre by allocating buttons that tallied to a character's limb rather than the strength or speed of an attack. The square and triangle buttons, for example, were for the left and right arms, and the X and circle buttons were for the left and right legs, kicking moves. Now, my personal feelings on the gameplay aspect is that, Tekken gameplay did go on to become truly great in later installments. This game, 1994, Tekken 1, it laid the foundations for this greatness, but in and of its own accord, it's by no means an epic sort of, it's a landmark game. It's a historically significant and important game, but it wasn't perfect. I mean, there were discrepancies with the speed of movements, with the fluidity of the game. A case in point, I'm kind of playing this as I'm talking, but the grapple maneuvers and simple attacks like, a quick punch and a quick kick, they can be delivered with great speed, but there's a significant few seconds of lag in recovery time if you get knocked off your feet, which kind of skews the combat element to almost, luck based. It's almost like, can you recover before they do this really quick attack on you? So, it kind of prevents you from becoming truly proficient because there's always an element of chance in the gameplay mechanics due to the hindrances of the gameplay mechanics. And while the movesets are kind of good for the time, they are somewhat primitive, and they are a blueprint for what would go on to be, brilliantly realised fighting styles that we see in Tekken 3 and beyond, really fast, kind of fluid movements of the characters that we see in Tekken 3 and beyond. But yeah, I mean, for the context of the time and in the wider picture of gaming history, Tekken's gameplay is an innovative step forward for the genre and the time and place in which it was published. Now moving on to characters and story, and I feel that the characters are an incredibly significant and contributing factor to why Tekken is as renowned as it is today. But there are so many characters. I mean, I could sit here all day and talk about Tekken's roster, particularly the original 8 that are in this game, and their respective sub-bosses, I suppose, because they all have a place in my heart. You know, it's kind of, they're very nostalgically attached to me. But for reasons of time and economy, I suppose, I'll have to cover some characters more thoroughly in later videos. I mean, for example, there's the tag tournament games where I can talk maybe about the sub-bosses at length. And, you know, as the cast does go on to get pretty extensive, I could go on and just talk about the additional characters in each additional installment of the videos. So for now, I can kind of just cover, you know, in brief, the main cast. So first off, I suppose, Kazuya Mishima. Now, Kazuya is undoubtedly the main character of this game. He's the most prominent on all the marketing. He has his own little candle punching segment, you know, in the interim videos that you get if you leave the menu screen on. Yeah, I mean, he's the main character, but I'm hesitant to label him as the protagonist of this game, as, you know, relating back to how Tekken breaks away from existing games in this genre. There is no hero to this game, there's no protagonist, you know. Prior to the events of this game, you know, the tournament that you are participating in, Kazuya has literally sold his soul to the devil to help him return from near death and defeat or kill his own father. So I think he can be considered, at best, an anti-hero, but that's pretty much it. On a personal level, I've always considered Kazuya somewhat cold. I think he's a very misanthropic person and character. And the whole angle that was taken in Tekken the Motion Picture, where Jun Kazama makes him realise his goodness, you know, and kind of claims him back from the whole devil thing, I don't really buy that. I think Jin was probably conceived as an act of lust through Kazuya and Jun, but I certainly don't think the character of Kazuya is capable of investing pure emotions in anything other than revenge and, you know, hatred for his father and, you know, later his entire kind of family. So yeah, I mean, this lead character doesn't really create the recipe for your classic good guy versus bad guy narrative. And for the first two games, you know, the first 2 Tekken games, Kazuya is just pure anger and, in my opinion, just pure 100% awesome. Which leads on, I suppose, to why I think it's kind of unfortunate that, in my opinion, his awesomeness only lasted 2 games. It sort of peaked in Tekken 2, where, you know, the literal embodiment of his evil, that is the devil character, had a really prominent and dramatic role as the main antagonist. And, you know, that those last 2 bosses, Kazuya and the devil, you know, they are really great. But after this, the reins of the series were kind of handed on to Jin, and Kazuya was put, you know, to a large extent on the back burner of future installments, and he kind of has to share the limelight increasingly with, you know, his son Jin, his father, and now his grandfather, which is kind of a shame, because, you know, I think we'll find, and I'll discuss later, how the plot, the main story arc of Tekken is becoming pretty convoluted. And also, I feel that Kazuya's role and the Mishima bloodline plot in general, which really started out in these first couple of games as, you know, dramatic and, you know, serious, and in the first 3 games, you know, it was really impactful and it was cool. And by the way, I didn't actually mind that Kazuya was omitted from the 3rd game. I thought that was good. I thought his absence was good, because you knew he was going to come back. And there is a little segment, a little cutscene, if you leave the menu on in the 3rd game of Jin, Jun, and I think Kazuya's in there as well, which is, you know, it's really cool. It was sort of a foreshadowing of him coming back. Which is why it's unfortunate that the whole Mishima plot was rendered into a sort of parody, and it started making fun of itself in future games with endings. You know, I recall one ending, and I can't remember what game it is. I think it might be 3, or maybe it's 5. But you know, there's one where the Mishima relatives are being strapped to a rocket and shot into space. I think it's a Heihachi ending. I'm not quite sure. But, you know, it's become extremely drawn out and convoluted, and where I think they could have done so much more with it. Really, they could have kept it, this kind of dark vengeance sort of plot instead of making it really, really quite stupid and about the Mishima Zaibotsu more than it is about the kind of family feud, and the more spiritual angle, which was, with the ogre and the devil and things like that. It's kind of unfortunate, and I think they really do need to kill off one of those Mishimas permanently, because there's so many relatives being introduced to this game now. So, anyway, yeah, back to Kazuya. I mentioned in passing earlier the archetypal aesthetic of the kind of Ryu character, which dominates this sort of genre of game. Now, Kazuya really breaks the mould of this formula by being whittled, he's been stripped down to the bare essentials identifiable as a fighter. His classic outfit is a torn up karate trousers and red studded excuse me, and red studded sparring gloves. He has this kind of identifiable, genetically crazy Mishima hair, and the chest scar as well. They make him really stand out. But despite this, there was a kind of strict adherence to kind of authenticity and reality that helped him kind of stand out. I think you're far more likely to see a guy in a tournament like Kazuya than you are to see a kind of, Ryu headband wearing. It's just a bit kind of passé now, the whole headband karate uniform thing. So I think, he kind of broke the mould in this respect as a main character and an anti-hero. His Tekken 1 ending is also really cool because it kind of prompts it sets the cycle in motion of the Mishima blood feud, where he gets revenge on his father in a similar fashion to how his father kind of done that to him as a child. So, it was really cool. It was a really cool ending, and it showed the degree of potential that this story arc had for future installments, which unfortunately kind of petered out for the entire series in general, really. Now, moving on to Paul Phoenix, and it's important to talk about Paul second because he was, and I definitely read this somewhere that was sort of official, but he was definitely set up to be a more significant character than he unfortunately ended up being. And this is a reason that actually I feel quite bad for Paul, and it's not just that he's this badass that never got acknowledgement for his prowess at fighting, which is his story arc, but it's the fact that in this first Tekken game, he is being set up to be a rival of Kazuya's, and I feel that this was something that was meant to endure over the course of the series. But it seems that Namco opted to change direction, and he has been relegated, along with martial law and, Kuma. He's been, rendered to the status of recurring comic relief for the franchise. Which to be honest, it really quite sucks. I think Namco realised that with the Mishima bloodline plot and Kazuya's feud with Heihachi, maybe they didn't have room for Paul to kind of get in on the main sort of action. But up until Tekken 3, he had serious clout, and again, despite the haircut, he had a certain degree of seriousness. And maybe this is just me reading too much into it, because I'll admit, Paul is my favourite character. Paul and Yoshimitsu, they are my favourite characters. And despite what's been done with him since, this whole comedy angle they've gone for, and with Yoshimitsu actually, I'm glad that he's kind of endured and he's been a staple of the series, and I believe he's appeared in actually every single game. So, I'm just kind of glad that he's in it, really. Aesthetically, Paul, he generally flips between his red judo uniform in every game and motorcycle leathers. Both of these, I think, are kind of awesome. Along with his mixed martial arts moveset, which to this day is the only one I know absolutely inside out, up to the current game Tekken 6. The only problem with the aesthetic and the appearance and the character of Paul is his voice acting, which I feel is absolutely terrible. But what did we expect, really? Once you've been kind of relegated to comic relief, there's no hope for any ounce of coolness coming back to you, it seems. So, which is a shame, because again, looking at his Tekken 1 ending video, which is my favourite for Paul actually in all of the games, his Tekken 1 ending is my favourite, with the bottle kicking and the wall punching of Kazuya. You know, it shows the potential he really had to be a dramatic and serious adversary to Kazuya or Heihachi in future games. But unfortunately, you know, that just wasn't to be. Now, moving on to Yoshimitsu, who frankly is great. You know, he's a clear return to the more sensationalist aspects of the fighting genre, with his metallic kind of Pan-Asian / medieval uniform that he has in this game. He has a sort of Japanese Oni demon mask and a massive sword, which sort of distinguishes him, you know, right off the bat as one of the only characters to carry an additional armament until I think Gunjack in Tekken 3. In terms of plot, Yoshimitsu is inherently a good character, and I think this is actually pretty cool because it's totally at odds with his increasingly bizarre appearance as the series goes on. It's also interesting because Yoshimitsu, as a clear-cut good guy, is on the fringes of the game's main story arc, so rather than having, you know, the really good hero kind of guy centre stage, as with most fighting games, and I suppose kind of game plots in general, he's really kind of out there on the fringes, and Kazuya fills the main character gap as this amoral, kind of evil kind of guy, you know. With Yoshimitsu's look, his outfits, and what I term these as proper outfits, that is, you know, the outfits that you select with triangle or square in Tekken's 1, 2 and 3, these three outfits in Tekken 1, 2 and 3, they are my favourite, and I really feel that they kind of lend themselves to a whole samurai sort of aesthetic, which I personally kind of love. However, I think the interesting and a pretty cool thing with Yoshimitsu's appearance as well is that if you select him with, you know, the X or circle button, he takes on a more European medieval knight sort of look, and I think, you know, it's certainly the first 3 games he kind of takes on these kind of different appearances with depending on how you select him. But it may well be the later ones as well. In Tekken 3 and beyond, he sort of goes through a transformation into what I believe is referred to as a space ninja. I mean, a lot of people call him a space ninja. But, you know, I like this, and I think one of the things I most look forward to with each new Tekken release is, you know, how have they made Yoshimitsu more crazy? You know, that's something I kind of look forward to seeing, and you know, his appearance in Jaws is one of the more positive aspects that the series kind of has maintained, you know, as a lot of it has kind of deviated a lot from what it could have been, and perhaps should have been in the earlier games. His moveset is also awesome and totally kind of crazy. I love learning his movesets in each new game, as he always gets a new oddment, a new crazy sort of move, you know, such as the poison breath and using his sword as a helicopter and all that sort of stuff, and I really feel he makes us a proficient fighter if you know how to use him properly. And I also find, in my opinion, me personally using him, I find him to be one of the most quickest and one of the more formidable characters you can be in combat if you really know how to use him. In terms of character development, we see Yoshimitsu first as a sort of Robin Hood character, but then, you know, he kind of goes on to have a short-lived story with Dr. Boskonovich, and at the moment he's kind of gone on to have a mini feud with Brian Fury. You know, we see the characters throughout these games, they all have miniature feuds, and it's just to kind of keep them continually relevant within the story arc of the game, really. There's not much to write home about Yoshimitsu's story. It's just good to have him in it. It's good that he's a kind of staple character. And I think I preferred his feud with Kanemitsu, actually, because Kanemitsu's a brilliant character. I think she's, you know, her moveset and how she looks is just completely awesome, especially in the newer games, the tag tournament games. But you know, perhaps I'll talk about, you know, Kanemitsu and Yoshimitsu in a later game, one of the tag tournament games, when I have more time. Okay, next up is Jack. I'm not going to linger too much on Jack. He's the sort of obligatory Goliath that you get in fighting games, you know. He's a Russian cyborg, military cyborg. He's somewhat reminiscent of Zangief in the Street Fighter series, I find. You know, he's sort of big and clunky. Not the usual character I go for, and his ending is also pretty boring in the first game. Again, however, he's one of the more sensational aspects of the Tekken plot, and he's a staple in the series as well. So although I don't really like Jack, and he doesn't do anything for me, I'd probably be disappointed, you know, if he wasn't actually there. Now, Nina Williams, I think Nina is great. She's your classic kind of femme fatale sort of character. I believe she features in every installment of the game. I think she does, and in a lot of ways, her feud with Anna is better realised, in my opinion, than the Mishima plot, because it's consistent and it doesn't get too, ridiculous and out of control. Nina is also, as I mentioned at the beginning, she stars in this game called Death by Degrees, which is sort of an action game, and I think this is kind of important to mention because she seems to be given a lot more, I suppose you can call it screen time, than other, kind of minor characters. Her cryogenic freezing, for example, in Tekken 3, and her relationship to Steve Fox, which is elaborated upon in Tekken 4. This tends to be promoted in Tekken 4 on a par with the Mishima storyline, which is kind of interesting because it shows that in many respects, in fact, she sort of demands a certain precedence as a female lead in the Tekken games. Despite the brief entry of Jun Kazama in Tekken 2, and the later introduction of Asuka Kazama in Tekken 5, who again is another kind of relation to the Mishima plot. Nina seems to really kind of dominate these games as the female precedence. Her appearance is also pretty awesome, and I think both her outfits in this first Tekken game are the best in the franchise to date. Her first outfit and general outfit throughout the games is a kind of classic black on purple sort of assassin attire, kind of skin tight attire, and her secondary outfit is a black on yellow martial arts uniform, and she just looks really kind of cool. Her Aikido based moveset is also great and develops really well as the series progresses. She's quite hard to beat in arcade mode, and she has a really kind of fluid, formidable style. My only real gripe with Nina, in fact, is her voice acting in later games, because from the outset she's Irish, if you look at her nationality in the literature and the booklets and whatnot, but she's always voiced as an American, so it's a kind of minor gripe, but go figure. I don't know why they done that. Now, martial law. Law, of course, along with Forest Law, is famously modelled on Bruce Lee. His moveset reflects the Wing Chun, Chinese boxing, Kung Fu, whatever it is Bruce Lee done, because I can't remember, but that martial art that he later formed into a basis for his Jeet Kune Do philosophy. That's what Law does. He also sports the yellow all-in-one costume that's reminiscent of Bruce Lee's Game of Death movie, and his kind of proper costume, as I call them, is simply black trousers, which I believe relates back to Bruce Lee's performance in Enter the Dragon. And again, I think Law's a kind of cool example of how Tekken makes real-life connections and brings the genre back down to reality. It's kind of an intellectual nod to the player that Tekken and Namco are conscious of the popular heritage of the culture of fighting in the media and outside of the gaming world. Unfortunately, however, of course, like Paul, Law and Forest Law later turn into characters of comic relief as the series moves forward. There's not much to kind of really write home about in his story arc. His cutscenes are generally pretty cool though, because there's a lot of action in them, and his Tekken 1 ending is comparatively warm-hearted compared to others, because he spends his tournament winnings on opening a dojo, which is one of the more selfless acts that we see these characters undertake in their endings. I think he's on a par with Yoshimitsu and King when it comes to being moral and just generally a good person. Speaking of King, this character is another that stands out from the crowd. Despite the whole mask thing, however, which makes him seem like these sensationalist characters, as I keep referring to them, he's really quite grounded in reality, as his martial background is in lucha libre wrestling, so it has a point, really, the whole mask thing. His story arc is pretty straightforward, and to a large extent it's quite tragic. He's an orphan trying to raise money for an orphanage. He fails, he turns to drinking, then eventually gets murdered by Ogre in Tekken 3. But the righteousness of King's plight, as I've already said, sets him apart as one of the few inherently good characters that we see in this game. And it's quite nice to kind of just have a character that's not driven largely by vengeance or the desire for financial gain or pride. His appearances are also really cool in each Tekken game. King and King II, as it is from Tekken 3, they're either in classic wrestling gear, or they're in casual gym attire, which sounds kind of basic and not that much to kind of talk about, but it just somehow really works well with the mask. He kind of really comes across as a cool looking guy. His feud and allegiance with Armor King is also pretty awesome, as both these characters really stand up as aesthetically sound characters, and also in terms of gameplay they have really great and original movesets that are grounded in lucha libre wrestling. Unfortunately, King's endings in the first couple of games, and particularly 1994 Tekken, this first game, aren't really much to write home about. But what can you do? Michelle Chang. Now, Michelle, to her credit, she is really quite badass in this first game. She has a fantastic kind of look, as the whole Red Indian thing. It's like, yeah, I can totally kind of go along with that. My problem with Michelle Chang is that I associate her with Julia Chang from Tekken 3, who I just really hate, and her appearance in Julia's ending in Tekken 3 also sees her as really quite a flimsy, kind of old motherly character compared to the badass that we see in these early games. And I know it's a petty observation, but her resolve to get revenge on Heihachi for whatever reason in this first game, I think maybe he killed her dad or something like that, it really just sort of peters out into nothing, and as such it kind of makes Michelle seem a somewhat irrelevant character. Again, as I mentioned with Yoshimitsu, there's a mini feud / relationship that develops, and there's a half-baked plot with Ganryu falling in love with her, or maybe he falls in love with Julia, I can't remember which, but whatever it is in these later games, it's just more evidence of how Tekken's narrative really took a downturn at some point after Tekken 3. And so Michelle's cool to play, she's cool to play against, but doesn't really do anything for me, and doesn't really contribute much to the overarching plot of the Tekken franchise. Anyway, I'm sorry for that tangent. I knew I was going to talk for ages about the roster of Tekken, but I really feel they are intrinsic to the quality and the success of this game. I don't know why I don't write. I should probably just start writing a blog or something. It's easier to kind of, convey things at length that people can scroll through rather than yakking on. But maybe that's something I'll look to do in conjunction with these audio clips or videos, whatever you want to call them. So yeah, finally, before I kind of wrap up, I'll just talk about the music. And in my opinion, all of the Tekken games, from number 1 through to number 6, have fantastic soundtracks. Personally, I feel that 2 and 3 have the best soundtrack, but this first game does have some redeeming, qualities and some really impactful tunes as well. The ones that stand up for me are the Acropolis stage, which is the sort of Greek monument stage, the Marine Stadium, and also Sichuan, China, which I've got the soundtrack here, and I'm just reading the back of the case. It says Sichuan, China. So, yeah, these are all distinctive in my opinion. They are really good examples of the mood that's set for each respective level of this game, and also the kind of adrenaline that kind of it gets you going, it gets you in the mood for the action of the game for the 2 or 3 rounds that you're going to be fighting. So even if you're on a really hard stage and you have to repeat it numerous times, I find that the tracks don't actually get old, which is really a testament to the quality the Namco sound team are capable of. So yeah, they're generally really good and memorable tracks. Anyway, that's about it for the first Tekken game. I think I've kind of covered all the bases that I wanted to. As previously mentioned, I'm going to be looking at the main canon, the main installments of the Tekken series. So next time I'll be looking at Tekken 2, followed shortly thereafter by Tekken 3, and perhaps the 1998 animated motion picture. As I said at the beginning, I think that motion pictures, movie adaptations for fighting games are interesting when it comes to the developer trying to elaborate on plot points that kind of get lost on you, and may well get lost on you in game if you don't read the additional literature that you get. So yeah, Tekken 2 saw significant advances made on the foundations that were set by this 1994 game. It also introduced more characters that would go on to equally become renowned as fantastic examples of this franchise, and its brilliant roster. Springing to mind is obviously Jun Kazama, Lei Wulong. They are really kind of cool characters, and I think they were the 2 main ones that were introduced, but there was a couple more sub-bosses and things like that I can go on and talk about. So yeah, I look forward to kind of going on and discussing this series more in depth as time progresses. So until next time.